Hello, everyone. Let's discuss the ethical guidelines that are used for animals while conducting psychological researches. Now, before we begin, I'd want you all to have a look at the syllabus, have a look at the requirements by the CI. You should all know what all you should be familiar with, what all you should be able to describe, what are the evaluative aspects that the CIE wants you to keep in mind while preparing. Now, to begin with, if we have a look at the syllabus over here, this very clearly shows that describe ethical guidelines describe ethical guidelines that are used in psychological research in relation to animals. To begin with, minimize harm. Number 2, replacement. Number 3, species. Number 4, numbers. Number 5, procedures that include pain, suffering, distress, housing conditions, reward deprivation, aversive stimuli. Towards the end, we are also advised to know how to evaluate studies based on ethical guidelines and to apply our knowledge of ethical guidelines to novel research situations. Now, without any further ado, let's begin with the first one here, that is replacement. Now, what does replacement mean over here? Just because a research is being conducted on an animal, that doesn't mean we start taking animals for granted. Remember, they are living things. I'm not saying they're human beings, because of course we have different ethical guidelines for humans. Do not get confused amongst them. But nonetheless, they're living beings. They're living things, right? So replacement, a researcher or the researchers team, they should try to the best of their capacity to replace or to come up with an alternative, right? Come up with an alternative technique of maybe conducting a research without involving animals in it, right? So researchers should consider replacing animal experiments with alternatives. You could do that. There's a possibility that there's a research that is conducted on that particular subject matter before. You might as well use videos from that. You might as well give a thorough read to the previous studies that have been conducted earlier. You might as well use computer simulations. So anything that could do, or any alternative that could be thought of to be used as a replacement of a real animal being used in a psychological research, the researchers should try to do that. One. Number 2, species. While conducting a research on animals, the researchers should, again, to the best of their capacity, figure out what particular species would it be that would experience the least amount of suffering, the least amount of pain, the least amount of distress, right? So do your homework first. The chosen species should be the one least likely to suffer pain or distress. Other relevant factors include whether the animals were bred in captivity. Now, does this ring a bell here? Animals being bred in captivity. Remember, the two researches that are part of your psychology syllabus for ACE amongst the 12 core studies. The first one by Fagan et al. This research was on captive animals, right? Another research by Hassett et al. This was on captive monkeys, right? So instead of going to the jungle or going to the wildlife and picking up animals for there that you'd want to participate in research, it is always advisable that you conduct a research on captive animals, animals who have already been in captivity. So other relevant factors include whether the animals were bred in captivity, their previous experience of experimentation, and the sentience of the species. What does the word sentience over here mean? Its ability to think and feel. So choose your species wisely. Number 3, the number of animals. Now, like I mentioned earlier, just because it is animals that you're conducting research on, that does not mean you would take as many as you possibly can, or you could just get them from here, there, and everywhere and start conducting research on them. So even if you're conducting research on animals, or when you're conducting research on animals, it is your responsibility as a researcher to keep the number minimum, right? See if you can get your thing done with 5 animals. See if you get your thing done with 1 animal. If one works, that's amazing. If more than 1 are required, then you tuck, 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 then you keep on adding. But then again, try to keep the number as a minimum as you possibly can. Only the minimum number of animals needed to produce valid and reliable results should be used. To minimize this number, pilot studies should be considered. What are pilot studies? Again, you conduct small scale researches before the actual research to check for the feasibility of the research. Minimize the number. Pilot studies should be conducted. Reliable measures of the dependent variable should be used. Good experimental design and appropriate data analysis should all be used. But again, the point over here is try keeping the number of animals that you want to research on minimum. The next procedure, Research on animal is controlled by legal requirements and or guidelines from relevant organizations because studies will necessarily affect the animals in some way or the other. However, for research on animals to be effective, the animal's experience should, as far as possible within the constraints of the research being conducted, be as normal and as positive as you could make it, right? So if you're conducting a research on animals, try not to mess up with their day-to-day routine. Try to keep their routine normal as it was and try to make it as positive as it could be. Now, again, this reminds me of the research that was conducted by Fagan et al. Remember, minus the training hours, the animals kept on, they continued with their routine, including grazing time too. So there are therefore guidelines to help psychologists to care for their research animals as well. Now, the next one, pain, suffering, distress. Try not giving any sort of pain to your animals. Try avoid procedures that might avoid procedures that might result in the animals experiencing pain, suffering, or any sort of distress. Research causing death or suffering, such as disease, pain, injury, physiological and psychological distress and discomfort, should be avoided. Where possible, designs which improve rather than worsen the animal's experience should be used. For example, studying the effect of early enrichment on development compared to normal rather than early deprivation. Alternatively, naturally occurring instances may be used, example, where stress arises naturally in the animal's environment or lifetime. During research, attention should be paid to the animal's daily care and veterinary needs, and any cost to the animals should be justified by the scientific benefits of the care work. So try not causing them any sort of pain, suffering, or distress. If you have to, then in that case, it better justify in terms of the scientific gain that you're having from that research. Moving on real quick, let's talk about housing over here, housing conditions. Isolation and crowding can cause animal distress. Isolation causes animals distress. Crowding causes animals distress. Caging conditions should depend on the social behavior of the species. For example, isolation will be more distressing for social animals than solitary animals. Overcrowding can cause distress and aggression as well. The level of stress experienced by individuals should also be considered. Between testing, animals should be housed with enough space to move freely with sufficient food and water for their health and well-being, both in terms of the biological and ecological needs. I'll just want to highlight this one. The one highlighted in green. However, the artificial environment only needs to recreate the aspects of the natural environment that are important to welfare and survival. Example, provide them with warmth, space for exercise, or somewhere to hide. Environments that are visually appealing to people may not be those that are best for an individual species. Now, just because a cage seems fancy for you, you built up that cage for the animal, and then you restrict the animal's movement to that particular cage. That might be something that's aesthetically appealing to you. You need to think about the animal over here as well. Does it work for the animal? If it works for the animal, amazing. If it doesn't work for the animal, you better give it a thought again. So environments that are visually appealing to people may not be those that are best for an individual species. Cage cleaning should balance cleanliness against avoiding stress, example, caused by unfamiliar smell or disturbance by humans. Taking it ahead, moving on towards reward, deprivation, and aversive stimuli. Try rewarding animals, right? For instance, again, from the study that was conducted by Fagan, or the study that was conducted by Fagan, elephants were being rewarded. Try not depriving them. It is not right to keep the animals deprived out of something. Do not use aversive stimuli. Do not use, your procedure shouldn't include anything that ends up being distressful or uh, that ends up compromising the comfort of the animal. So do not give them pain, do not use aversive stimuli. Deprivation is the removal of resources that are important to an animal. In planning studies using deprivation, the normal feeding or drinking patterns of the animal should be considered so that their needs can be satisfied. The use of preferred food should be considered as an alternative to deprivation. For example, rewards in learning studies and alternatives to aversive or in other words, unpleasant stimuli and deprivation should be used where possible. Now, I could go on and on describing this to you, explaining them to you, but then again, the purpose behind this video is revision. I'm trying to make it as quick as possible. Moving on, I want to quickly show you a couple of questions that we've had in the past on ethical guidelines related to animals, so that the content that we just revised, you should you know where to use it, or the type of questions that you could possibly get on them. So Hanif is investigating helping behavior in animals. As part of his experiment, two chimpanzees are put together, but it is possible that they might hurt each other by fighting by hurt each other, for example, by fighting rather than helping. Now, this has chimpanzees mentioned over here. Your syllabus just changed. Before this, like pre-2024, there was a research that was conducted by Yamamoto et al., and that was on chimpanzee learning. So this is just to give you an idea that you might as well get questions related to studies by Fagan, related to the study by Fagan or by Hassett et al. So Hanif is investigating helping behavior in animals. As part of his experiment, two chimpanzees are put together, but it is possible that they might hurt each other, for example, by fighting rather than helping. Explain how one ethical guideline which relates to animals is relevant to this study. So it's again a 2-mark question. You are required to explain. You get the first mark for identifying relevant ethical guideline, and you get the second mark by linking it to the situation that is in front of you. So an example could be pain and distress, right? Of course, if animals start fighting with each other and they end up hurting each other, that would cause them pain. That would be distressful for them. So this should be minimized as if they were hurt in the fight. This would physically be painful and stressful for them. So you get the first mark, you get the second mark. There are 2 other examples that you could use as well. So the ethical guideline of pain and distress has been used. Minimum necessary number of animals should be used. Analgesia should be used. Analgesics, that are painkillers. If you should have painkillers with you, just in case the animals fight and they hurt each other and they're experiencing pain. You might use analgesics. Moving on really quick to the next one. Again, I've deliberately chosen this question to show you that we could get questions on studies that have anything to do with the ethical guidelines of animals related to the studies that are a part of our AI psychology syllabus. So the study by Pepperberg, again, has been a part of our syllabus for 6 years. Pre-2024, this was one of the core studies. So the study by Pepperberg, parrot learning using an animal, explain what is meant by deprivation and aversive stimuli in animal research. Now, again, you could get a question of a similar nature. Let's just replace this part. I'll just make it easier. So let's just say we replace this part, and it says us, the question says, the study by Hassett et al. used animals, explaining what is meant by deprivation and aversive stimuli in animal research. Or the question might as well say, it's the study by Fagan et al. Used animals, explain what is meant by deprivation and aversive stimuli in animal research. Again, this happens to be a 2-mark question. There are 2 things that we have been asked to explain. Deprivation is doing without something. Deprivation is doing without something. Deprivation is, for example, an animal not being given food or water. Aversive stimuli over here. Aversive stimuli, things which are present that the animal does not like, is afraid of, or that hurts them. Aversive stimuli include electric shocks, aggressive animals, or loud noises. So use any example that works for you. Now, why did I choose this particular question? I chose this particular question to show you that you could get questions on novel research situations as well. So having a look at this one real quick, Dr. Kwan plans to investigate whether any species other than chimpanzees will offer help. During testing, each animal will be with another animal, but afterwards they will be kept in a separate cage. Now, again, chimpanzees, remember when I said we had a research by Yamamoto on chimpanzees that was a part of our syllabus. Having a look at the question real quick, explain one ethical issue Dr. Kwan should consider in choosing which species to test. You may use an example in your answer. See, choosing what species. Remember, this was one of the ethical guidelines, right? So how do you get marks in this one? You may get 1 mark for linking issue to animal species. You get the second mark for detail about potential ethical problem. This may include a relevant example. So remember, this says may. If it says may, it's on your discretion. You want to use an example to secure that second mark, do it. If you think you can secure that second mark without using an example, that works fine too. So he would have to choose a species that would cope with both social company and isolation. See, over here, if you may read this again, this has to do with social company and isolation both. So while choosing a species, Dr. Kwan should be mindful that he chooses an animal that is good with being socially isolated or good having a social company as well. There are several other examples that might help you too. Moving on to the real question, next question, real quick. Dr. Kwan has considered testing whether the animals can help each other to avoid pain. Dr. Kwan has considered testing. What is Dr. Kwan trying to test? He's trying to test whether animals can help each other to avoid pain. Explain why this might be an unethical procedure. The animal that needed help would have to be pain, which is unethical. The animal that was supposed to help might be distressed if it could not stop the experimental animal's pain, which would again be unethical. So to be able to test this, of course, one of the animals would have to go through pain. So keeping that animal or making that animal go through pain is unethical. And at the same time, if the animal that is the potential helper animal, the potential helper, right? If the animal that is expected to help is not, because of any reason at all, able to help, that might be distressing for that potential helper animal too. Taking it ahead, Dr. Kwan should use as few animals as possible. Remember, what was the word? The word over here, the word, the ethical guideline over here was the number of animals. This one, number of animals, right? Look at how we are putting them to use, right? We're talking about number of animals. Remember, only the minimal number of animals should be used while conducting a research. So getting back to this, the question over here reads, Dr. Kwan should use as few animals as possible for ethical reasons. State why it would be, and it would also be important that Dr. Kwan uses a big enough sample. Again, if the sample is too small, the findings may not be representative of the species. The results may not generalize to the rest of the species. So again, this last question doesn't directly have to do with the ethical guidelines. Nonetheless, it was there. We read it. Moving on real quick to the next question. Again, this is a question on a novel research situation. The question over here reads, Dr. Gopal is planning a study. Dr. Gopal is planning a study about learning and wants it to follow ethical guidelines for the use of animals. He's testing rats in a maze. So we're talking about Dr. Gopal. Dr. Gopal is planning a study about learning and wants it to follow ethical guidelines for the use of animals. He's testing rats in a maze. Describe how Dr. Gopal should follow the ethical guidelines of housing in the study. So this is another ethical guideline that we just read about. This is a 2-mark question that is requiring us to describe. So 2 marks either for a point with detail, an example, or for 2 simple points. You could write anything. Like all of this, I'm sure you are aware, has to do with housing, or alternatively use this sentence. Now taking this ahead, Dr. Gopal, again, Dr. Gopal is deciding how to train the rats to learn. He could reward them when they make a correct turn in the maze, or he could punish them when they make an incorrect turn. Explain why one of these training methods is the most ethical choice. Now, rewarding over here is more ethical. He should use food because it is nice, because noise is distressing. Again, you have picked up points from here. Yeah. Now, I hope this makes sense. Taking this a step further real quick, there's actually a 6-mark question that I want to get to while spending the least amount of time that I can. Now, again, a question that says, explain 2 ethical guidelines for working with animals. This is a basic question. Out of the list that we just went through, use any points. So replacement, we've studied species and strain, numbers, minimum numbers of animals should be used. The procedure should not cause any sort of pain, suffering, or distress. Again, this one has to do with housing, reward, deprivation, and aversive stimuli or uncomfortable stimuli, or anything that causes animals any sort of distress. Anesthesia, if the research has to do with anything that if the procedure has to do with anything that would cause the animal pain, use anesthesia. I'm sure you all know what anesthesia is, right? Anesthesia, what your dentist uses while you go visit him, right? So euthanasia, for the ones who do not know what euthanasia is, euthanasia, also referred to as mercy killing. If you have, I mean, try avoiding it, of course, avoid it. But if you have somehow gotten the animal to the point of no return, when living is painful for the animal, and when you think it's better that the animal dies, and yeah, so mercy killing, I think the word mercy killing explains this all. Do not make the animal suffer. If you think you've crossed that line, then use measures that would help the animal uh, die. Yeah, help the animal die, and get peace. So moving further. So this was a 4-mark question. Oops. Yeah, this was a 4-mark question where 2 ethical guidelines are to be explained. So you again pick one and then you explain it. You pick one and then you explain it, right? Pick any you want. Explain one advantage of using animals in research and psychology. Again, this is a question from the past papers. Animals are unlikely to be able to work out the aim of the study, so would be less likely to respond less to demand characteristics than humans. Use another example as well. State what is meant by ethical guideline of replacement in relation to animals. Choosing not to use animals to use a species that will suffer less. Example, using humans, assimilation, so on and so forth. Suggest one practical problem with following the ethical guidelines of replacement in relation to animals. It may be harder to interpret the effects of your experiment on a different species. So again, moving on, describe the use of ethical guidelines of numbers. Look at the amount of questions you've had. See, but this happens to be a 6-mark question. Describe the use of the ethical guideline of numbers and housing in relation to animals in research using any examples. Again, it's a 6-mark question. You are asked to describe the use of ethical guidelines of numbers, that is, use minimum amount of animals, and housing conditions in relation to animals using any examples. So this was to show you that, yes, you do get a 6-mark question as well. Remember, this says use any examples. Now, the example that has been used over here was on the study by Pepperberg. Pepperberg, remember, I had said this was again a core study pre-2024 syllabus. But then again, you could use any example. You could make up an example of your own as well. So we have other questions too. Another 6-marker before I bring this video to an end. Describe the ethical guidelines of numbers and replacement in relation to animals using examples. Now this marking scheme that you have in front of you, this is this is comprehensive, and this provides a better explanation. You could pause it and read through this. Yeah, I hope this has helped you revise the ethical guidelines that are to be kept in mind by researchers while they conduct their researches on animals. I hope this has helped. Thank you.